So the topic is not only post-traumatic growth, but I would also like to draw your attention to surrendering. What is surrendering? How surrendering to God can help us overcome difficult life situations. So first I would, do you see the PowerPoint now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I will now briefly go through some definitions or briefly introduce the topics of my presentation so that you can follow what I'm saying. So coping, what would coping be? That the term is usually used to denote how we struggle and how we fight against extreme stress and traumatic experiences. Coping means that somehow going through different stages of recovery, we are able to not only survive, but to live more full life. So even after traumatic experiences, we're supposed to be better off than before. So religious or spiritual coping refers to the way people use their faith in order to get through difficult situations or traumatic experiences. It was introduced by a researcher or scientist, Pargament, in late 90s, this idea of spiritual coping. But of course, we all know that religious people were using their faith all the time, centuries ago, millennia ago. Now, the third idea is surrender coping. One of the research findings of Pergament was also the fact that we use different styles of religious coping. So I will introduce all four of them, but the last one that was introduced is so-called surrender coping. And you will see what makes it different from other styles of coping. So usually surrender is defined as an active choice to surrender to God's will or God's plans. So I give up my own will and I surrender to God's will. But in addition to this idea, I think that coping, surrender coping involves more than merely this submission, this act of submission. And the fifth topic would be the idea of post-traumatic growth, which somehow comes from another field of science, from psychology, from victimology, and it explains that people, when they go through difficult situations, usually they become stronger. And this situation is more natural than post-traumatic stress. So almost 80% of people report that when they were going through losses or when they were mourning death of close ones, or suffering injuries or abuse even, they became stronger, and the researchers tried to understand what makes this, what contributes to this growth, and they somehow defined 7 areas in which people are experiencing this growth. So the main idea of my speech would be that there are some parallels that we can draw between what psychologists discovered about post-traumatic growth and between what we understand, or I understand, as surrender coping. So there are 2 important parallels. One would be that none of these processes involves experiential avoidance. So it involves full acceptance of self, of what I'm experiencing, especially pain. And then it also involves willingness to open up to and seek comfort in some other person or being. So this would be my main idea. And now I go with my presentation. And please, Mari, stop me if I go too long. So Now we must understand that people, when they recover, they go through different stages, and not every kind of coping is appropriate for a certain stage. So first they usually are in shock, and then they go through emotional whirlpool or roller coaster, when emotions exchange each other, and somehow people cannot find peace of mind. And then the third stage would be adjustment. The question with adjustment is, are people just surviving and they are still living in this alertness, in this surviving mode, as we say? Or are they actually living a usual life as they did before? And that is why the fourth stage was introduced, sort of reintegration, which involves the kind of fruitful and creative living. The focus of psychology lately is especially on this fourth stage, which brings people to a new level of living, that they live better than before. And they say, I would never change my life, or I would never want to live my life differently. I know I suffered a lot, but I'm stronger now, or I look differently at life now. So that's why this fourth stage is now in focus of research and thinking in psychotherapy as well. So religious coping involves 5 functions, or has 5 functions. We just go quickly through them. So the first function would be that faith helps people find some meaning in suffering. This is very, common. And then control. This is a different and very multifaceted function. So how do we achieve control? By relying on our faith and God. That's the big question. Comfort, another big area of research and thinking. How do we achieve, or how do we seek comfort? Do we turn ourselves to our God as Father, or do we turn to saints? Do we pray, and so on? Intimacy, again, how faith can help us establish new relationships. And then the fifth function would be that maybe our traumatic experiences are instigating or are helping us achieve a true life transformation. Okay, now findings that were done when researchers were talking to people who went through difficult situations. Findings are very unanimous, and they show us what we can summarize by this saying: there are no atheists in the trenches. This is a saying that comes from the First World War, because all soldiers in the trenches were praying despite their previous atheist views, but that is very extraordinary situation. So when we are in danger or in extreme danger, when we fear for our lives, of course we all pray. But this is just an extreme situation. Researchers also wanted to know how in less extreme situations people use their faith. And they discovered that actually religious and spiritual coping is very efficient. It helps us when we are either physically ill or disabled, but also with mental health issues, when we experience homicide of our family members, when we experience loss of our child, or when we are survivors of domestic abuse. All these people, including people in the United States after September 11, they all say that faith and prayer help them cope with the situation. Now, criticisms arose, and some researchers and thinkers would say that first of all, not all research is so unanimous, so we have some ambiguities, and we can also maybe we know someone who's using faith and religion in a wrong way and is getting no benefits from it. And also research actually confirmed this view that we have religious coping, which is not only not successful, but is actually detrimental to people's health and well-being. And also some critics argued that actually religious coping is nothing but psychological coping dressed in religious clothes, which again turned out not to be true. There is a genuine and then specific religious coping that contributes to well-being, even if we somehow control effects of other factors like demography, medical status, psychological variables, and so on and so on. So there is something specific in the religious coping that doesn't overlap with psychological methods of coping. So a solution to this ambiguity was that researchers then differentiated or distinguished between positive and negative religious coping. So let us go through what they found out. So religious coping would involve several mechanisms like forgiveness, purification, which means getting rid of all your sins and resentments and so on. So religious direction, conversion, help from clergy members, spiritual connection. So all these positive forms of coping were then discovered to be related to positive psychological methods of adjustment, like acceptance, happiness, optimism, purpose in life. So it turned out that positive religious coping methods are closely related to positive psychological methods. In the same way, they discovered that negative religious coping is related to negative psychological coping. Now, what would negative religious coping be? This would be experiencing God as a punisher, someone who's giving us this pain or suffering, then pleading for his intercession, like, God, why don't you help me? I'm in distress. Then spiritual discontent, which means that I'm troubled with the fact that bad things happen to good people, and so on. So all these kinds of religious turmoil turned out to be negative and turned out to be connected with some psychological negative ways of coping, like anxiety, burden, negative mood, disregard for other people. Okay, another way of approaching this ambiguity about religious coping was to distinguish 4 styles of coping. Collaborative, self-directed, deferring, and lately also surrender coping. Now let me briefly go through the 4 of them. Collaborative style, as the title says, is when the faithful people, the believers, turn to God as to someone who is in constant dialogue and who works with them on this problem, on the suffering. Deferring style would mean when individual would rely completely on God's help without taking any personal responsibility or without being active. Self-directed style is actually the opposite of deferring style, when believer wants to take care of himself, relying on his own resources and somehow not hoping that God would come and help him. This would be a self-directed style. Now, the 4th coping style is a sort of a mixture and but also sort of a deepening of all these styles, because these styles are pretty stereotyped, as you can tell. Nobody relies on a single style. I guess we all use all three or maybe all four styles when we cope with situation, and we try all four of them in hope that one of them will be effective. So, but the surrender coping would mean that we not only hand over our lives to God and we abandon our will, but it involves something more. And I would like to speak now about this more. Surrender coping is active in distinction to differing coping style, and it's like collaborative style. It is aimed at recognizing God's plan and working with Him, although giving God's will a priority, but it's not completely abandoning my own will. Okay, now I'm taking this example from how Jesus abandoned his will and surrendered to his Father's will, in order to point out that the surrendering involves more than just this abandonment or submission. It's accepting and witnessing of one's internal experiences. Jesus knows what he's going through and what will await him. Now, again, it also involves the recognition of a higher value or meaning in a difficult situation. And that's also very important. If we submit ourselves to God's will, there's a recognition that our suffering has a higher meaning. Then the third component or element in submission, in surrendering, would be the experience of self in the relationship of God, whom Jesus sees as a sort of support and comfort. So surrendering is not passive, but it also involves a lot of hope. And And the fourth element would be experience of collaboration with God in active coping, as we saw before. Now, let me summarize now what we went through until now. Surrendering to God's will is more than a cognitive decision, an act of submission to someone's authority, an exercise in willpower, a battle of wills, an act of despair, an injunction or commandment to abandon oneself. It can also involve these elements, but I don't think that these elements are essential. In my view, abandoning oneself or surrendering oneself involves an ability to seek comfort in God's embrace and use Him as a source of support. This is the reversal, I think, in our usual way to use God in our suffering. So it's an ability not only to, how would I say, it's like in a relationship of father and son. If the son is following his father's will, this can sound as a very authoritarian relationship. Like the father knows what's good for me, or the father is the boss and I'm just following his orders. But there's another component in this father-son relationship, and this is the fact that I have to trust my father. I have to use him as a sort of comfort. So I come to him with all my thoughts, feelings, pain, and suffering, and I somehow throw myself into his hands. I put all my life in his hands. And the research showed that people who use this kind of religious coping, they're not using God as an external source of control. Like, I have no control over my life and my suffering, now you do the job. No, it turned out that people who use this kind of attitude, they have this internal sense of control, which means I know what's going on and I'm still active. But regardless of this fact of my internal sense of control, I surrender to God. So in this case, surrendering to God involves an inner process, or presupposes an inner process of accepting and processing the total score of emotions, cognitions, and sensations related to my pain or to my hurtful experiences. Conclusion? Maybe just this final saying from the prophet of Gibran. When you love, you should not say God is in my heart, but rather I am in the heart of God. And this is the reversal that I was trying to combine with what the research says about the surrender coping and post-traumatic growth. And because also post-traumatic growth can happen only in the case when I don't avoid the pain. Then I can grow. Thank you very much for your attention.